In this short presentation on syntax, I'll be talking about the innateness hypothesis. Before we do that, we should talk a little bit more about the term universal grammar. In a previous presentation, I said that one of the goals of the study of syntax was to produce a universal grammar. A universal grammar is a theory of grammar that can describe any natural language. It would be a theory of grammar that is just as useful in describing Japanese as it is in English. According to Radford, a theory of grammar must enable us to devise a descriptively adequate grammar for every natural language. In other words, our ultimate goal is to develop a theory of universal grammar. But why should there be a universal grammar? Why do we believe such a thing exists? Why should we expect that very different languages that originated, or at least evolved, independently of each other, should have enough in common that a single theory of grammar could adequately explain them? Why shouldn't we expect different languages to be fundamentally different? Not just different on the surface, but fundamentally different, different at the foundations. But why should linguists expect grammar to be universal? Where is the evidence that the grammars of each language are not fundamentally different? What evidence do linguists have to support the idea that there's such a thing as universal grammar and that to some degree it's innate? We can identify a great number of commonalities, and these commonalities suggest that languages are connected, that all languages are language, and that language is something that is constrained and emerges with reference to a specific set of rules that all languages must conform to. But Radford says, the central phenomena that any theory of language acquisition must explain is this: how is it that after a long drawn-out period of many months, in which there is no obvious sign of grammatical development, at around the age of 18 months, there's this sudden spurt as multi-word speech starts to emerge, and a phenomenal growth in grammatical development takes place over the next 12 months? An answer to both sets of questions is that language is innate. It's in the brain. You're born with it. And this isn't to say that German babies are born with German in the brain, but that we're born with an innate capacity for languages, and that capacity is structured in a specific way that shapes what language can be. This innate capacity would explain why children can learn languages so quickly, but it would also explain why very different languages conform to very similar sets of rules. If we're born with a capacity for languages, then what those languages can be is going to be limited and shaped by that capacity. Whatever it is in our brain that gives us a capacity for languages also shapes what that language can be and what kind of rules it would need to follow. So here's where the innateness hypothesis comes in. The innateness hypothesis is the hypothesis that children have a biologically endowed innate language faculty. So let's take this apart a bit. It's biologically endowed and it's innate. They're born with it, everybody is. And it's a language faculty. It's a faculty specific to languages. We're not making claims of other types of competence or intelligence being innate. The belief is that language learning is different in kind from any other type of learning which human beings experience, so that learning a language involves mental processes entirely distinct from those involved in learning to play chess or learning to ride a bicycle. This is a quote from Radford, 1997. And so it's a biologically endowed language faculty that children have. Notice the claim isn't being made that adults still have this language faculty. The discussion of what happens to the language faculty as we age is looked at under another hypothesis called the critical period hypothesis, which we're not going to talk about now. So the innateness hypothesis is the hypothesis that children have a biologically endowed innate language faculty. And this hypothesis relates to the study of syntax in a number of ways. Through the study of syntax, linguists hope to gain insight into this innate language faculty. How is it set up? What does it do? What exactly is innate? The way in which this language faculty would operate is that the child experiences language in their environment. This experience of language acts as input to the language faculty, which then tells the child subconsciously how to process, interpret, understand, and produce language, shaping that child's grammar. Thus, writes Radford, the input to the language faculty is the child's experience, and the output of the language faculty is the grammar of the language being acquired. What evidence is there to support this innateness hypothesis, that children have a biologically endowed innate language faculty, that children are made to learn languages? One is the uniformity and rapidity in children's linguistic development. Children learn their first word by the age of 12 months, and this single word stage continues for about 16 months. And there's little evidence of grammatical development until around 18 months. But then, around 18 months, children start producing plurals, two-word utterances, and otherwise demonstrating some grammatical development. By 30 months, this is approximately a year later, children have acquired most of the inflections and core constructions of their language. They still have a lot of work to do, but they have the basics. Why is it that this pattern of development, well, it does vary, is relatively common? How can we explain the fact that children achieve certain things with language in very similar ways at very similar ages, regardless of the language they're learning? The argument is that there must be an innate language faculty, because it's impossible to explain the speed of acquisition in any other way. So uniformity in the patterns of acquisition and the speed of acquisition are cited as evidence of an innate language faculty, but so is the uniformity in the types of grammar. The types of input are going to vary widely, but children end up coming up with very similar grammars. There are differences, but the similarities are far greater, and greater than could be explained on the basis of the input. Children of the same age are much more likely to come up with different answers to a math problem than they are to come up with different ways of forming yes-no questions. Further support for the innateness hypothesis comes from the poverty of the stimulus argument. The argument goes like this: how is it that children are able to learn so much so fast with so little evidence? Children learn to do things that they're not taught to do. But they also learn not to do things even though they were never told that they shouldn't do those things. Parents don't actually correct children's grammar very much. Children get very little feedback on their grammar. How is it they learn not to do specific things? More evidence for the innateness hypothesis, or indirect evidence really, is the competence despite degenerate input. Not only is the input children receive inadequate in amount to explain their level of acquisition, it's also often very poor. Children are exposed to lots of interruptions, false starts, disconnected speech, asides, baby talk, ungrammatical structures used in baby talk, but they still end up with something fairly grammatical at the end. How do they end up with a relatively grammatical version of the language despite the degenerate input they receive? More evidence for the innateness hypothesis is that language learning seems to be fairly independent of intelligence. Even individuals with major developmental disorders, they still have an ability to use language that outstrips their ability to do many other things. If language was a problem to be solved without a language faculty supporting that problem solving, there would be many more humans who couldn't do it. Even people with serious cognitive impairments can produce language which has a level of complexity that should be beyond them. And finally, language learning is subconscious and involuntary. Children acquire languages without a great deal of apparent effort, and without a great deal of guidance, and without even being consciously aware of what they're doing. Children acquire languages without much effort being made to teach them languages. This also suggests that there's some kind of capacity for languages which is innate. A behavioristic perspective on learning says that animals and humans acquire habits as responses to specific stimuli. Something happens, we respond, and that response is reinforced or not. The predominance of behavioristic psychology led to an understanding of language learning as habit formation, and language teaching as involving repetition, imitation, and reinforcement. Modern syntax argues that this perspective cannot be correct, and that language cannot be due to habit formation. So how do we know that language learning and language acquisition are innate as opposed to habit formation? If language were habit formation, how could we account for our ability to recognize the grammaticality and non-grammaticality of different sentences that we've never heard before? Despite never having encountered a sentence, we can tell it's incorrect, and that can't be due to habit formation. More evidence that language learning isn't simply habit formation is the rule generalization that children do. Children produce past tense forms such as comed and goed despite never having heard them before. They're generalizing the rule that to make the past tense form of a verb one adds an ed ending. So creativity and generalization of rules and hypothesis testing seems much more important part of language than habit formation. Finally, children also produce novel sentences and structures that they've never heard anyone say to them before. The three of these things together, the ability to recognize the ungrammaticality of novel sentences, the ability to generalize rules, and the ability to produce novel sentences and structures, demonstrates that language learning is not essentially habit formation. Finally, more evidence that suggests language learning is more creative than imitative comes from studies of children. One of these studies is now popularly known as the WUG test. So let's see if you can pass the WUG test. This is a WUG. There is one WUG. Now there are two. There are two. Did you answer WUGs? Now, did you pronounce it wugs or wugs? Wugs or wugs? Have you ever seen a wug before? Have you ever heard of a wug before? Your ability to add the plural s and to use the voice pronunciation of it, z, was not due to imitation because you've never heard of a wug before. Even very young children are able to come to the same conclusion as you did, showing that they do not learn languages solely through imitation. They've never heard the plural of wug before, but they come up with it through some kind of creative process. So, in summary, the evidence points to support for the innateness hypothesis, the hypothesis that children are born with the biologically endowed capacity for learning languages, as opposed to a behaviorist perspective that sees it as habit formation. That children have this innate capacity helps to explain another one of our questions, which is why our language is so similar. Why do they seem to have a universal grammar?